far to the south, really between this area here of what was Gascony, what we might also consider Aquitaine. I think we have heard of that. So let's take a look at what this area looked like in the Middle Ages. So again, zooming in, Toulouse here, Pyrenees, Spanish border right down here. Here we have the Mediterranean, Montpellier, Narbonne, Perpignan. So we've got the coast here, Toulouse, and then as we go southwest, Montrejos, again with our dates. If you take a look at the other dates again, just to focus in a little bit on what this area looked like in terms of Augustinian monasteries. Toulouse, 1267. Here we have Montpellier, 1280. Narbonne, 1256. It's about the first in this area, 1256. Toulouse follows closely. Then we have a series as sort of concentric circles going further and further out from the mother house in Toulouse into the late 14th century. So I think we have a good overview there of these different foundations, all of these being Augustinian monasteries. So I can't spend very much time except just a minute or so to kind of give us a flavor of what was going on in this region in the 14th century. Now we could go all the way back, all things pretty much English and French start in 1066. I think we have that ingrained in our brain. 1066, we know what happened. The Normans came over, conquered England, and what was left, essentially the Duchy of Normandy and England were then under a single duke, the Duke of Normandy, who then became the King of England. This broad area here, here's our star of Montrejos, was English in the 12th and 13th centuries. This belonged nominally to the King of England through, you might remember, Eleanor of Aquitaine. It's a great movie on it. The Lion in Winter, I'd recommend it. She brought to the English crown the Duchy of Aquitaine. So what is French at this point in the 12th century, you can see, is quite small. The 100 Years' War. We see here, this is running through the slide, this area, the English growing, receding, growing, receding. Over the course of 100 years, the French and the English were at war. So throughout the 14th century, starting in as early as 1337, we can talk again a long time about the causes, but you have throughout this area essentially almost continual warfare throughout the 14th century into the 15th. The cause of all of this, as you can see, French propaganda poster, I think. The King of France, Philip I. Here we have Edward I in the 1280s. The only problem with this picture, the King of England is kneeling at the feet of the King of France, doing homage to the French. The French thought that was just fine. Edward I's grandson, Edward III, then in 1337, thought it wasn't fine anymore, refused to do homage, and essentially started the 100 Years' War. Brutal battles, again, we don't need to go through and list all of them. The English had the better part of the first half of the war, Crécy, Poitiers, defeating the French army, taking vast areas of land. Here we see it in a contemporary manuscript. But there's one other event, 14th century, I want to sort of get you in the mood. What was going on in Europe in the 14th century? One, I think, still one of the best history books on the subject is Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror, the calamitous 14th century. Really an entire century of nothing but bad things happening. The Black Plague, an absolutely unimaginable, I think, to us, event that in the course of a couple of years in the middle of the 14th century, 1348 to 1350, 1351, it had come and gone and killed in its wake estimates of anywhere between 100 and 200 million people. I don't think we can imagine that. The estimates are that 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population of Europe was wiped out, decimated, completely gone in the space of 2 or 3 years. Absolutely unimaginable. The map simply shows how it came in from the south, through the trade routes, made it almost throughout most of Europe, especially in the area. So as we're imagining this community, this area of Toulouse, Montreuil, we have to imagine sort of the two, at least two horsemen of the apocalypse, in this sense, war and plague, and by 1350, there's almost no one left. Well, we have, as a result, a huge religious movement. People obviously believe this must be the end of time. Half the people are gone already, and what will happen to the rest? Here we have a very nice rendering of St. Francis. St. Francis is earlier, around 1200, 1220s. The reason I picked this one, I think it's an especially nice rendering, but it's also from our time, so about 1350, and it's actually in the museum in Toulouse. So something, again, that our people would have been looking at. Let's talk about monks, or friars, my favorite. My favorite friar, not a monk. Sean Connery here was playing a Franciscan in, anybody remember? The Name of the Rose. The Name of the Rose. 1986. I was actually in Germany at the time. A lot of it was filmed in Germany, in an old monastery that they used for the filming. 1986, Sean Connery was a Franciscan, William of Baskerville. It's another great read. Also, interestingly enough, it takes place in the middle of the 14th century, 1367, I think. So we're starting to get, at least sort of pop culture, if nothing else, an idea of what this time was all about. There are others. The Franciscans is one order of so-called mendicants. Mendicants, from the Latin mendicans, means to beg. The begging friars, those who renounced all property, also property held in community. Dominic, Saint Dominic, who founded the Dominicans. Also around the same time as the Franciscans, these were the first two mendicant orders. And again, this is a small technicality, but details sometimes matter, I think. We don't call them monks. These are friars, from fratres or frère, brothers, who did not remove themselves from the community, but were in fact sent into the community to preach. So we have the Dominicans. The Dominicans are probably most famous for their scholarship. St. Thomas of Aquinas, Albertus Magnus. We have universities named after these gentlemen, scholars of the 13th century. Let's move to our own friars, the Augustinians. So who were they? In British usage, I think I'll kind of go back and forth. They're known as the Austin Friars. Maybe you've heard of them. Still active houses, in England certainly, either Augustinian or in Great Britain, the Austin Friars. This is their symbol, a pierced heart going back to St. Augustine talking about his heart being pierced by the love of God. The book, of course, for scholarship. Here we have a not very accurate rendering because we have St. Augustine, of course, the namesake of the order, who died in 430 in North Africa, giving his monastic rule to the Augustinians, who were founded in 1256. So we've got a little bit of time distance, but that's okay. You can do this, especially if you're a saint. But it's important, certainly for the Augustinian order, to represent the sense that Augustine's own rule for living, the rule for his monastic community, was the one that was handed down to them and the one that they were in fact using in the Middle Ages. That's the connection between Augustine and the Augustinians. Now, being originally German, Stephen's laughing, he knows the joke. When I hear the word in German, Augustiner, and I'm in München, in Munich, I think of one thing, beer. The Augustiner beer is one of the best, I think. Certainly in Munich and all of Germany. We have still this wonderful tradition of friars and monks brewing beer. What again is even more interesting, I think, we know that monks and friars like their taste of beer. The brewery itself